to Prototyping AI Ethics Future with the Just AI Network. This event is kindly co-hosted today with the British Academy, Arts and Humanity Research Council and the Ada Lovelace Institute. I want to start off this introduction by signaling that we have closed captions available. You can find the closed caption button at the bottom of the Zoom window, or alternatively, you can find the stream text link that is located in the chat. And the stream text link provides a more efficient delivery of real-time text opposed to the Zoom platform. Okay. My name is Louise Hickman. I am a senior researcher with the Just AI Network. I am delighted to be having this panel today with all these wonderful people that we will soon introduce. But what I want to do is just give briefly a kind of background information on the panel and how we came here today. I have been working with Alexa. We have been running together a working group on rights, access and refusal. And in this working group, we have been working with two PhD students, Clarice and Harsha, who Alexa will introduce briefly in a bit. And we have been working together in ways that we've been thinking about access to VR technology and how perhaps we can think about access to VR technology as a visually impaired person and thinking through providing access in these settings using co-authorship. And I think something maybe Mara can pick up later on and thinking about crypto authorship, that's something that could be really interesting in thinking about what this means for access and refusal. So, to take a step back before we introduce the panelists for today's discussion and the respondent, Sarah, I just want to kind of give a kind of broader kind of outline of the Just AI project. We have been working as a team for the last year to bring together, well, we kind of using network prototype as a way, as a methodology to think about what it means to bring people together. We often speak about bringing multiple stakeholders together, but when we say that, what we actually mean by stakeholders is people and their lived experience. I want to quickly echo a comment that Edward Harcourt, the director of AHRC, made on Monday when we kind of introduced the week that we're currently in the middle of, is thinking about what does ethics mean and how we use the label of ethics and how those labels don't really often apply to real life lived experience. So I really hope today's conversation, we're going to really move beyond these kind of labels and really think about how we understand text in our everyday lives and the possibility of refusing as well. So how can we exist outside these systems? And when we ask these questions about refusal, we're also asking who has the option to refuse, who can take those risks. Another point that I really want to draw on in the kind of launch on Monday, which I really think makes sense for today's discussion, is really thinking about networking and thinking how we convene people in these conversations is a type of methodology. And so I think this is a really useful kind of way to think about, especially the scholars and researchers we have today, is thinking about what type of methods we use. In this project reviews, literature mapping, design methodology, and so forth. And but in thinking about these methodologies, we have kind of used fiction as a way to, as a knowledge make, a way to make knowledge. And the scholars in critical disability studies often write about, and these being Alison Tafer, Amy Hembray, and they talk, in their work, they talk about designing for people with disability frictionless future. So the idea that technology comes in and serve as a function as a, to write disability out of the future of design and technology. So in thinking about fiction and thinking how this is relevant to everyone's work today, I think it's really kind of exciting to really think about what exciting, perhaps the wrong word, but refusal. Like, again, who can take that risk and how do we do that in our collective work? So I will briefly close out this kind of introduction of the Just AI project and how this panel came into formation. I just quickly want to signal that tomorrow at the same time, 1 p.m, we have the Just AI Fellows, which Sarah is included in this cohort, who will be presenting their work from the last 6 months on the racial justice panel. So I think Hannah will put this into the chat box so you can find, or maybe you already have. So this will be tomorrow, and I encourage you to sign up for it. And now I'm going to hand it over to Alexa.
Hello, it's such a pleasure to be part of this week's amazing events. I see that Hannah just put a link for Monday's opening event in the chat, and I really encourage people to watch that if you didn't have the chance. It was really powerful. So I'm Alexa Hagerty. As Louise said, it's my great pleasure and honor to be co-convening this group with Louise. This working group. I am an anthropologist. I'm based at the University of Cambridge at the Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence. And I get to introduce this absolutely wonderful panel, which I'm going to do without delay because we have so much to talk about and not that much time. So it's my pleasure to introduce Alex Taylor, a sociologist at the Center for Human-Centered Interaction Design at City University of London. With a fascination for the entanglements between social life and machines, his research ranges from empirical studies of technology and everyday life to speculative design interventions. He draws on feminist technoscience to ask questions about the roles human-machine composites play in forms of knowing and being, and how they open up possibilities for fundamental transformations in society. Crystal Lee is a PhD candidate at MIT and a fellow at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard University. She works broadly on topics related to the social and political dimensions of computing, data visualization, and disability. She also conducts ethnographic and computational research on social media communities. Crystal's research has been supported by the National Science Foundation, the Social Science Research Council, and the MIT Programs for the Digital Humanities. Previously, she was a visiting research scientist at the European Commission. Mara Mills is Associate Professor of Media, Culture, and Communication at New York University, where she co-founded and co-directs the NYU Center for Disability Studies. She is also founding editor of the journal Catalyst, Feminism, Theory, Technoscience, winner of the 2020 4S STS Infrastructure Award. Mara works at the intersection of sound studies and disability studies. Most recently, she co-edited the book Testing Hearing, The Making of Modern Orality. Her public arts and humanities writings can be found at sites including Triple Canopy, Art Forum, Public Books, Somatosphere, and Avidly, which is a channel of the Los Angeles Review of Books. Our respondent today is Sarah Chander, a Just AI Racial Justice Fellow. And again, there's a link to the event tomorrow in our chat. Sarah's project explores how to develop a truly racial justice-oriented approach to AI policy. She's also senior policy advisor at the European Digital Rights in Brussels, and she has a background in racial justice, queer liberation, and anti-immigration detention. She's interested in the radical power of refusal. So I'm going to pass back to Louise to begin our self-descriptions.
Thank you. I am a white person wearing headphones. I have a fringe that is slightly too short and maybe misplaced at the moment. And I have a purple dress, which was supposed to be a yellow jumper to go with it to symbolize the colors of the Just AI project. And I have Alison's office in the background with some drawings. And now I will pass this over to Alex.
Hi, thanks, Louise. I am of mixed Asian Chinese descent and I identify as he, him. I think Crystal's next.
I'm an East Asian woman with bangs and a blue-black shirt, and I'm in an overlit room. And with that, I'll go to Mara.
Hi, I'm Mara. I'm a middle-aged white woman with a brown, messy bun from getting up early. I'm sitting in a hotel room in Texas so I'm not in my native habitat of New York, which has a tiny apartment with blank white walls. I'm in a room that's bigger than my apartment with sort of wooden shades on the windows and white brick walls. And I go by she, her. Let me pass it to Sarah.
I use she, her. I'm the descendant of Dalit Indian immigrants to the UK. And I'm coming to the session today very tired, but very exhausted from conversations about legislation divorced from their impacts on real people.
I'm Alexa, my pronouns are she, her. I am a middle-aged white woman sitting with a blurred background and wearing a gray sweater and a black top. So we're going to kick off our presentations, beginning with Alex.
Thank you, Alexa. I just wanted to start by saying what an honor it is to share the floor or maybe share a platform, we have to change that these days, with such thoughtful scholars and people that I've been thinking with. So it's nice to actually see them, if not be with them in person. So I wanted to take the opportunity today to think with some new ideas, in a sense, for me. And specifically, I want to discuss the grounds on which we think about access and disability. And that notion of the grounds is going to be something I'm going to try and come back to during today's panel and in this short 10-minute talk. But before I get to the grounds, I want to take a step back and start with the impulse that seems to pervade the thinking in technology circles. And that's the impulse to find problems to solve. And I think many of us are kind of familiar with that rhetoric within engineering and technology, that technology is all about solutions to problems. And I think that, you know, as much as we try and resist that, I think it really still does pervade an engineering and mentality around technology, but also in particular AI. So I just wanted to talk briefly about my own experience there. I have worked at in two big technology companies during my career. I worked at Xerox very early on in my career, and just recently I worked for Microsoft for about 13 years in Microsoft research. And so I've encountered this sort of, if you like, this impulse to be driven by finding solutions. And this is particularly the case in, for example, computer vision and AI systems for the blind and vision impaired. And so quite often you'll see computer vision being promoted as a way in which we might solve the problem of sight impairment or vision impairment. And to me, and I think probably many others on this call, that's a real an affront to ideas of disability, that somehow we might solve the absence of something like vision. And so, you know, much of my own work has been in, if you like, resistance to or refusal to that kind of dialogue in which we're somehow solving the absence of something. And of course, that absence might also be something like hearing, etc. And I think many other people on the call will be familiar with that sort of rhetoric. So just to sort of set the stage, if you like, I want to invite a resistance or a refusal to the idea of solving the problem of disability. That's been a sort of, if you like, a key feature in my work in this space. So I'm particularly inspired by the thinking of disability and critical disability studies scholars. So friends like Cindy Bennett, scholars like Christine Kelly and Alison Kaffer, and also people like Mara, who's here on the call. So for me, what's interesting potentially in this space is the idea of a refusal from the ground up. And that is to mean that we might refuse the way in which the problems get framed and the way in which solutions get approached to those problems. And as I said, the idea of refusing to see sight loss as a problem is sort of a first step in that sort of thinking. This kind of orientation for me has come from a close collaboration with Cindy Bennett, who is blind herself, and both she and I have been working to think about things like access and disability through AI technologies. I know Cindy in particular raises a lot of questions about the role of AI in supporting the blind and vision impaired. What I wanted to just touch on, and I didn't want to show this as a slide or anything. I'm going to actually paste the link into the chat. I hope this works, to a project that Cindy and I were sort of tangentially involved in, and I've been involved in since, trying to analyze the outcomes of some of the work. This is a project that began with a very close partnership with a young boy. I'll call him TH for the purposes of this call. I think his name might actually be on the link that I've shared with you. But TH and a team at Microsoft worked collaboratively for about 3 or 4 years, building a system that enables him to identify people in his social space, if you like, his social geography. And I think this is a really interesting example. I'm still not clear of how it kind of fits into this model of solutionism that we might sort of be critical of. But I think it opens up a space for quite a different sort of thinking about what AI might do for people. And so the idea here is not to solve or replace what we might see as a lack of ability on TH's part. It's in a sense to enable him to engage with the world differently. And the results of the ethnographic analysis that I've been conducting really show a very different orientation to the world on TH's part and his family's part. And so you see this really interesting kind of what Cindy and I have called interdependence between both TH and his family and the technologies, all coming together to kind of reshape the ways in which people are orienting to the world. And I think this, for me, if you like, is an example of this thinking about what we're doing around access and disability from the ground up, that we're actually trying to sort of, if you like, change something at ground level that then might help us reconceptualize the space for disability. Alexa, can you let me know when I'm sort of nearing my time, because I don't want to overrun.
Yes, you have about 3 more minutes.
Okay, so what I want to do in closing is sort of put forward a sort of different way of thinking about this. So I want to ask, I suppose, this is something I asked myself, and maybe this is something I pose to the panel and to the audience, and that is, what might it be to refuse the grounds altogether? And so thus far, I think we've been sort of refusing a particular orientation, the pairing of the solution and the problem. What my question now is, what might it be to refuse the grounds altogether? And I think Louise's sort of provocation at the beginning, how do we exist outside the systems, might also sort of have some kind of parallel to this. And when I invite that question, I'm drawing on scholarship in Black and Indigenous studies, scholars like Saidiya Hartman, Calvin Warren, and Audra Simpson, where they have deep and fundamental questions about the actual ontological basis on which we consider the being of the human. And Calvin Warren in particular talks about, for example, an ontological terror in which we might really have to ask ourselves, what is the human within the ontologies we operate in? What Calvin Warren invites then is a radically different understanding of our existences in the world. And he resists the very fundamental notions of ontology that philosophy and metaphysics orient to. This is a terror because, of course, so much is founded on our idea of being human. When you start to unpack and unravel the question of what it is to be human, then the question becomes what is left. Calvin Warren in particular is talking about Blackness and questions of race. And of course, these issues run very deeply. Calvin Warren refers to, for example, Black Lives Matter and assumes that it relies on an ontological ground that puts Blackness and nothingness together. And that's what he wants to resist. So what happens when the grounds are refused? Well, we might say the worlds in which the grounds are defined already structure our thinking about what bodies are and what they are capable of. And that, again, is what I invite a resistance or a refusal to. And that question of capability or capacity is a question I want to push back on. Warren talks about this as a circuit of misery, that the very language that we have to talk about, for example, race and Blackness, or we might say disability and ability, reinforces a sense of differentness and separation. So I invite us, as Warren speaks to this theme, to reject the terms through which we organize our existence and to ask what kinds of existences do we want to live with and in. And I want to refuse those questions that demand of us the separation between how we understand ability and disability today. Just as a very brief example, when I talk about refusal here, refusal could be, for example, through modes of fiction that Louise introduced earlier, but it is also, I think, through methods. So I'm particularly interested in the way Audra Simpson talks about an ethnographic refusal. So what kinds of methods might we start to adopt that enable us to refuse in a critical and scholarly way? Lastly, for artificial intelligence or AI, I think the question is whether this sense of refusal of the grounds altogether might give us something, whether AI might give us something to work with in this space. Thus far, I think AI certainly fits into our sort of ordinary nomenclature of thinking about ability and disability. And I'd like to think, well, what does AI potentially open up for us? What are the grounds by which we might think differently? And as Warren invites us to do, radically different ways of organizing our existence. So I'd like to leave it there. Alexa, I'm not sure if you want to introduce Crystal or...
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you. Crystal, you are up next. I'm already excited for our questions. So by the way, everyone, please feel free to add your questions as speakers are speaking in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. So Crystal, passing to you.
Okay, wait, let me see if Okay, I'm just gonna leave it like this so that I can still see everyone. So I really want to take up Alex's provocation to kind of think about refusing the grounds, to kind of think about what that looks like day to day. So as a grad student, I feel like this is the kind of compelling question that like goes through my mind every day when I go into a computer science lab, which is like, even if I convince the engineering grad student in the lab next to me that they should think about disability, that access as a process is important, that their technology that they've been building with their PI is oppressive, like what does this grad student then do when they go into the lab tomorrow? And I think that to me is an interesting microcosm of thinking about who gets to refuse technology, because it kind of gets at this larger question of not only the kind of bodies that are valued, and the kinds of participation that are valued in the technologies that we're talking about, but also the kind of invisible labor that supports the design and infrastructure. So to kind of get to this question of who gets to refuse technology and how, I think a lot of the guiding principles that I've been thinking about like stem from the Feminist Manifesto, which I'm sure many people in this call have read, but also this like larger swath of human-computer interaction and design scholarship that talks about anti-racist and intersectional non-intervention. And Alex is, of course, one of the main people that I've been thinking with here. But I mean, in terms of like thinking about compelling templates of action, I think obviously there's a way for us to disaggregate between individual and collective approaches, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But I think another kind of specter that really helps contextualize a lot of this conversation for me is thinking about how technology both under promises and over promises in terms of the types of changes that they can bring about. So I think in terms of a lot of these techno-determinist narratives, they under-promise insofar as, or they over-promise, sorry, I'll start there, insofar as like, you know, they paint some vision where like disability can be erased, where policing can be like perfectly objective, that like, you know, you can erase bias and like enforce fairness. I think there are these like large promises that we just have never seen actually fulfilled. At the same time, by like trying to over-optimize the status quo, or otherwise, by trying to over-optimize the status quo, these kind of technological narratives under-promise insofar as they refuse or like sideline the opportunity to radically reimagine social relations and the way that we value different kinds of participation or bodies within these technological systems. And so like thinking about this tension of like over-promising and under-promising within this like larger constellation of refusing technology, for me has been really evocative. But in order to kind of like transcend this double bind, I think being able to get scholars and engineers and practitioners to really learn from disabilities to think about access as a process rather than as a matter of compliance, and building that within the design process is I think the first step towards, as Alex says, refusing the grounds. So when we're trying to refuse to build or use these technologies to kind of push the questions a little bit forward, I'm thinking of two main ones. Like, can you afford to opt out of these technologies? Like, I'll use Facebook and Google as main examples. Like, do you have the time, resources, and effort to be able to maintain this like completely separate search infrastructure? Or do you have the expertise or privilege to navigate these processes? So, I mean, I think in some cases it feels pretty impossible, especially with the prevalence of CCTV. So can you opt out of taking a walk in the park? Or do you have the expertise to refuse certain kinds of inspection at the airport? Or for example, more recently, I've had some like really unsavory internet experiences and wanted to opt out of all of the systems, particularly in the US, that aggregate my personal address and cell phone number and all of these different things. And actually trying to like opt out of having my personal information shared took consulting with multiple lawyers and like who are friends, and like we're able to me, but I don't think that most people who are harassed on the internet have such a privilege. But beyond that, I think there's a kind of double bind of participation in design, in the sense that people of color, disabled folks, multiply marginalized people might reasonably opt out of training a surveillance system, for example, or any other AI system, like the ones that Alex talked about. But what are the consequences of opting out? Often that means that these people are never represented, but also opting in often means that they're making a system more precise at targeting them. And so I think in that case, it can be difficult to move beyond these tensions. So in terms of structuring the conversation about refusal a little further, and I'll try to speed through this, I'm drawing particularly on the work of Jonathan Zong and Nate Matias, where they really kind of triangulate these different dimensions of refusal. So they think about autonomy, power, and time. So in terms of autonomy, I think this is where the question of the individual and the collective really come to the fore. So is it about the aggregate uses of data in society, or is it about individual decisions about data that affect multiple individuals? As I alluded to earlier, there are lots of different power structures that limit the ability of people to refuse technology, either in terms of building it or in terms of using it. And there's a longer timescale of thinking about when to refuse. So is it when you say do not accept cookies, or is it about a longer proactive approach to redressing harm? But there too are lots of different forms of refusing ableist forms of technology. So there are 4 different rough categories that they've put together. So for example, if we're talking about collective action by affected communities, are we talking about class action lawsuits or government legislation? We're talking about expertise to facilitate refusal. Is it about expert testimony, education, advocacy, this kind of scholarship that people use on from the people in this call to try to facilitate ways for people to think about disability and refusing technology such that people can actually do it in the future. There are also everyday acts of refusal. I think my favorite one is digital homesteading or sharing Netflix passwords as a kind of everyday form of resistance, or even larger community-led forms like audit studies or bypassing publisher paywalls. There's a larger article about this, which I'll put in the chat, that has been really helpful for me to think about. How am I on time, Alexa?
You're doing great. You have 2 more minutes, so.
Great. 2 more minutes, 2 more slides. So I think to kind of tie all of this back to disability and technology, I want to draw a little bit on Ashley Shu's work, just so we have a kind of shared vocabulary in the discussion. And I think so one of the things that she's really honed in me is this idea of techno-ableism. So the narratives about technology and disability that reinforce ableism, usually by fixing people with technology. And I mean, I think techno-ableism comes about in many forms, and I think Alex has articulated a lot of them really clearly. And I think this, the way that this narrative often gets invoked when it comes to disabled folks often comes in the form of all of these different tropes, like moochers and fakers, or inspirational overcomers, the people who overcome disability through technology. But ultimately, I think these narratives about the purported users and the assumed designers often re-entrench these ableist and racialized and gendered ideas about who gets to access technology, either as users or makers and populations impacted by their use. So the entire cycle and infrastructure of people who get affected by these technologies. And so in terms of thinking towards the future to refusing to build and use oppressive technology, I mean, I think certainly this is where I'm like really interested in hearing from the other panelists, because I think there is like the kind of bare minimum that often isn't met, which is listening to disabled experience and refusing these ableist narratives, investigating and thinking about what internalized ableism looks like for ourselves. Like, I think these are things that are kind of like low-hanging fruit. But if we're talking more broadly, like, I think often there can be a misguided impetus to use engineering education as an individual fix. So like, if people just knew that they needed to like refuse ableist narratives, or like if they had just read disability studies, like maybe they would be better. I don't know that that is enough. I think it's, and I'm trying to think beyond this kind of individual fix towards collective refusal. So like, relying on a lot of the work that I've just talked about. But ultimately, I think the question that I want to talk about moving forward in this panel is who gets to participate and whose participation is valid. And here I'm really thinking about Dee Wu's work on disabled folks training Chinese AI systems and Liz Jackson's work on disability dongles. And I'm happy to talk about those more, but I hope that this broad swath of resources is helpful for other people to try to move forward on a lot of these issues. Mara.
Thank you, Crystal. That was terrific. And I feel so lucky to get to go after these two talks. You both have just set up so many of the topics and themes that are on my mind too. And I'll start by taking us sort of back, in a way, backward in time with an analog example that I digitized and that then presented a whole series of questions for me about refusal across analog and digital platforms. So I was really excited, and it was so fortuitous to get this invitation from Louise to talk about technology refusal, because I just donated a historical collection to the Lesbian Herstory Archives in Brooklyn a couple of weeks ago when New York City began to reopen. And this collection specifically generated all sorts of questions for me about refusal and about refusing the historians reading, and not just as a form of refusal, refusing to be collected, refusing to be read. So I'll start by just telling you a little bit about the collection, and then I'll end with giving you some of my thoughts and some theories of others about refusal and non-use, again, sort of both analog and digital at the same time. So the collection is a set of several hundred 4-track tapes, which is a rare and obsolete format that I digitized with my RA, Shafika Hashhash. And the tapes were originally commissioned by a feminist disability activist group, the Women's Braille Press. Women spelled with a Y for medium specific reasons, as well as the obvious political ones. One of the founders told me that the spelling with the Y is more aesthetically pleasing in Braille. So the Women's Braille Press Collective was organized in 1980 by 6 blind women in Minneapolis to publish Braille and audio versions of feminist poetry and memoir, all of the feminist serials that were being published then, things like Off Our Backs and Sojourner and Sinister Wisdom, health pamphlets, programs for LGBT events, you name it. In the 14 years before this collective disbanded, volunteers recorded over 800 cassette books for them, mostly in English, but also in Spanish and German. And many feminist authors, including Opal Palmer-Adisa, Judy Freespirit, who was the author of Fat Liberation Manifesto, Juana Maria Paz, they read their own works aloud for this group. The Women's Braille Press also published a quarterly newsletter with book reviews, health resources, calls to activism, very detailed accessibility guidelines for feminist events, and also very detailed personal ads, which poses a whole other set of privacy issues around digitization. By 1990, the collective claimed that their newsletter that had subscribers in 6 countries, and here's a quote from one of their publications, was the longest lived publication by, for, and about disabled women, and one of only a handful of publications produced in Braille, in print, and on tape. And over time, the efforts of this activist group resulted in a really unusual media access coalition that spanned many different disabilities, not just blindness. The constituency grew to include subscribers with learning disabilities, cerebral palsy, multiple sclerosis, reading epilepsy, ink allergies, and a whole range of other impairments. They also, despite the lesbian separatism that you might hear in their name, they also expanded to include trans members, which was relatively unusual at that time period. They also coined and popularized the phrase print disability in English in the early 1980s. They first published that phrase in a letter to the editors of Off Our Backs. Print handicaps was a library phrase that was already used, but they changed it to print disability for activist reasons. And I think this phrase print disability takes the social model of disability to its logical conclusion. You know, it's a category of disability based on the built environment, specifically media, rather than on physiology. So the cassette tapes themselves, you know, it was a cassette tape collective. They were circulated by mail to subscribers who paid a sliding fee, $25 a year if your income was over $15,000 a year. And they also circulated their catalogs in large print and audio and Braille. When they disbanded in 1994, they sent all 800 of their books, which was like thousands and thousands of tapes, to the Bureau of Braille and Talking Book Services in Daytona Beach, Florida, which is part of the U.S. National Library Service for the Blind and Physically Handicapped, or what's known as the NLS. It's a branch of the Library of Congress. And since that time, only participants in the NLS program, which was like a more restricted group than the original Women's Braille Press subscriber list, so only NLS subscribers have been able to check the books out. And to be an NLS subscriber, you have to have a medical certification or a paramedical certification of blindness or another print disability to avoid the payment of copyright fees to the book publishers. So by the time I learned about the Women's Braille Press, like 8 years ago, 200 of the tapes listed in the catalog had already been deaccessioned. This is like a library term for being thrown away as a result of, supposedly, of material deterioration. And then the remaining 600 were located in offsite storage and they weren't circulating at all. And they were about to be deaccessioned because they were recorded in this now obsolete NLS 4-track format that played at half the speeds of commercial tapes. There's 2 separate tracks per side on what's known as a C1 tape playback machine, which the Library of Congress had gotten rid of and converted to digital, and the tapes weren't being converted. Just as an aside, I was surprised to see that there's, in the 8 years that I've been working on this, there's now a cited ambient music subculture sprung up around making music with the C1 machines. They're very hard to come by, but they had this early time stretching capability that people love the sound of. So I worked for about 2 years with an NYU master's student, Shafika Hashhash, who's a subscriber to the NLS and a member of the National Federation of the Blind, to try to save this example of blind activism from being systematically destroyed by the National Library System. And through her own NLS contacts and like months of persistent phone calls and email messages, Shafika convinced the Florida librarian to locate and mail the thousands of tapes to us at NYU. But at that point, this is like a year or 2 in, that's where our actual problems with how to preserve and then make available this collection began. So we played some of the tapes on a C1 machine that I have in my office when they came in. So things like, if you know the literature of lesbian separatism, Dykes Loving Dykes, Dyke Separatist Politics for Lesbians Only. This was a book by Bev Jo, Linda Strega, and Rustin. Another Fragments from Lesbos, a book of poetry by Alana Dykewoman, who was the editor of Sinister Wisdom for many years. So we played a few of these and we found that all of the cassette tapes open with verbal injunctions, several of them in a row. So solely for the use of the blind was one. This is a quote that's typical for the NLS, but then also ones that they added. So they were for blind and print disabled women only. And then some of the books were also for lesbians only or for blind lesbians only. And now I'm a lesbian, Shafika's blind. Neither of us fell into the category of blind lesbians. And we started to ask ourselves, should we keep listening? What does separatism mean today when a lot of those groups have disbanded? The Women's Braille Press wasn't itself a separatist group. So many of the members were feminists and in fact not lesbians. But all of the tapes, even now, are still restricted by copyright law to blind readers. And then, like I said, some of the tapes are additionally restricted by this separatist warning. And that warning was also found on the original print versions. So, you know, can I listen to it as a historian, as a cited Dyke Loving Dyke? Can I listen to it? Can I write about it? Where should we put it after we digitize it? Who can listen to it? Where should it be held? Can clips be put online? You know, as a sound historian working on digital preservation, it also raised this question to me of what separatism means in the context of digital networked media that are so marked by the ideology of universal communication. It's very different than the print culture and cassette collective mode of communicating. So we tracked down, there's two living founders of the Women's Braille Press. We tracked them down. One is Marge Schneider, and she recommended that we donate the tapes to the Lesbian Herstory Archives, which we did after we digitized them. It was super expensive to digitize them, and we wrote a grant and did that. The Lesbian Herstory Archives holds a number of separatist collections in their basement, so including many other categories of separatism beyond lesbianism, things like BDSM separatism. So we just transferred the tapes to them, and we're essentially just letting the Herstory Archives make decisions about access going forward. And I have an article I've written about this group that I've never published, and I don't know if I will. I'm not sure how to move forward with publishing it. But this is a bit of a side note. What I want to take from this case is that for our talk today is that our conversation, is that this raises a lot of interesting points to me about technology use, non-use, and refusal. So, in disability studies, we know that most refusal by disabled people is stigmatized as this word non-compliance. Crystal mentioned it too. This is a very patronizing medical term with often very punitive consequences and permanent consequences. It gets NP, if you ever see NP in your medical file, that's not a good thing. It can follow you forever. For those who don't follow doctor's orders. On the other hand, regarding assistive technology, and I put that phrase in huge quotes, since we know from Catherine Ott that all technology is assistive, there are high rates of refusal for /quote non-compliance for a variety of really good reasons, ranging from lack of involvement of disabled users in prototyping and testing processes, to stigmatizing or unwieldy or outmoded design, to lack of training. Technology doesn't act on its own, lack of money, to lack of interoperability with other systems, and the list goes on for why it makes sense for there to be refusal. And more broadly, all technology has its refusers or non-users, as we've heard from Alex and Crystal. Although non-users don't often get featured as actors in our science and technology studies narratives. That's STS is the field I was trained in. Sally Wyatt, who's in STS, has identified 4 general categories of non-user, and I'll just add these terms to the great categories of refusal that Crystal shared with us. So she talks about resistors, people who choose never to use a technology, rejectors, people who stop using a technology voluntarily. Both of those are types of refusal. The expelled, people who are forced to stop using a technology after using it, and then the excluded, those without access for a whole variety of social and technical reasons. And then in terms of use itself, Wyatt argues, and it's good to just remember, because this also doesn't always come up in our stories about technology, that it's often forced, reluctant, or partial. It's not often like some wholehearted, adoption. So for the Women's Braille Press, exclusion was certainly one aspect of non-use, right? So to be print disabled was about exclusion. But for this particular group, being print disabled, they thought of it as a double disability. So exclusion from print at an earlier moment in the US meant exclusion from mainstream print culture, mainstream schooling. But even after the founding of Braille and talking book collections at the Library of Congress, print disability for the Women's Braille Press members meant exclusion from the feminist counterpublic, because the Library of Congress system itself systematically excluded most feminist and lesbian literature. They only allocated, taxpayers' dollars to produce talking book versions of things like the Bible, the Constitution, and as the Women's Braille Press, one of their pamphlets puts it, the variety of books that would be found in a small town public library, most of which they didn't want to read. They argued that literature plays a central role in the feminist movement of the 80s, and the ideas of feminism enabled many women to grow and make profound changes in their lives, end quote. So exclusion had profound consequences. Print, not exclusion from the Library of Congress system, and also just exclusion from print. And I also think that this group shows us that, non-use, whether it's exclusion or other types of refusal, can actually be technically productive. Non-users play a lot of roles other than just critique or resistance, and often transform technical systems through their own access interventions, or through the production of popular alternatives. So we see this with the cassette tape collective of the Women's Braille Press. We see this with talking books in general, which spurred the mainstream audiobook industry. Matt Rubery has written about this. We also, I don't have time to get into this, but talking books spurred the development of audio editing tools like time stretching. I'm writing a book on this with Jonathan Stern. Time stretching also is the precursor of auto-tune. And the last thing that I have thought about in terms of refusal in this group is just that exclusion or refusal can be a bottom-up as well as a top-down decision. It can be an activist tactic for security. Crystal touched on this too, for privacy, for preservation. And this is, it's not just structural. And, this kind of refusal is one that exceeds, of course, the category of blind lesbian separatism. It's common to many other groups. I'm thinking, for instance, of Indigenous data sovereignty efforts. And maybe I have a few other things that I could say about the tech industry today and the incredible difficulty of opting out. Crystal touched on some of these, so I could if I'm out of time, I could hold it for the Q&A.
Yeah, let's hold.
Yeah.
I really want to hear it, so let's get to it in the Q&A. But yeah. So maybe we'll move to Sarah and then circle into the Q&A, as obviously we just have so much to talk about. And I just want to also encourage everyone to use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen so that we can incorporate your questions as well. But Sarah.
Yeah, thank you. I have a difficult job to respond to so many amazing points that have already been raised, and so I will do my best. And I think maybe what helps is how drawn all of the panelists have been to the concept of refusal, the different functions it serves, and for refusal specifically, how it interacts with access. And so this also gives me a nice sort of springboard by which to react. Firstly, I think I just want to say that, I think that particularly in the context of my project, refusal, I see as a deeply necessary part of racial justice work, both inside the context of looking at technological applications, but also much more broadly. Rather refusal of systems, structural exclusion, dehumanization, some of the things that Alex has already mentioned, but also the constant work this takes. So the exhaustion this causes, refusal in everyday life practices, particularly for those that make racial justice and also disability work our day-to-day work. And in this regard, I will want to say that a lot of our Just AI work, particularly in terms of our labs, has also been looking at the intersection between access and refusal, and particularly in our labs, the work of Caroline and Erinma have really taught me at least a lot about how access can in many ways be about refusal. So the refusal of compliance with the very sort of exclusionarily defined ordinary functioning of things, which are definitely by design sort of constructed without and also in opposition to racialized and disabled people. Particularly, I just wanted to pick up on this notion of what are the functions of refusal that I think all of the speakers have spoken to. I wanted to build on some of that, particularly in terms of what's coming up in my work, in terms of exploring how refusal can be a functioning way to look at how to look at AI systems, and also policy that responds to AI systems. The first is that refusal in a policy space is also very much framed negatively. It's framed as sort of requiring non-action, requiring something to halt and stop. But often then in these more institutional spaces, what we miss then is also this like immense transformative and reimagining functions that come from the use of refusal. So not just being about non-use, but also like a fundamental basis of advocacy for alternatives. And perhaps by deploying refusal, what we do is do more to shift and transform than systems which seek to sort of reform current systems, particularly in a context of racial capitalism and innovation, when halting becomes a very difficult task with all the vested levels of power involved in the deployment of technologies in a corporate sphere. The second function that I wanted to pick up on is how resisting a refusal is also being in direct opposition to this sort of enabling function that a lot of the AI ethics space has, for the most part, fulfilled. So in effect, much of AI ethics has really been shown to see how they can implement corporate interests by either A, suggesting that there is a tech-based solution to every problem, and I think everyone has spoken to that already, and in many cases we are the problem, but also focusing on and how AI ethics enables in terms of how it focuses on mitigating, improving, and also further embedding sort of like carceral or surveillance-based technologies, rather than thinking about their abolition, what can happen in their space, and moving towards transformative and community-led alternatives. And I think all of us in our labs are reading and learning from the work of many, many different abolitionist thinkers, particularly Mariam Kaba. And I don't think we can have a conversation about refusal that doesn't align with a lot of the work on abolition that's been done, particularly like Black feminist organizers, particularly. The other thing that was really struck me by the interventions was that a lot of the work in this space around refusal is also about design futures. But fundamentally, those new visions on design, I think, must be anti-capitalist, because I don't think that we can expect the structures of technology design that exist in our world today to reimagine a future that doesn't embed ableism, capitalism, and racism. This is my thought, and I really want to provoke the sort of need to explore sort of an anti-capitalist alternative vision of refusal that doesn't suggest that we can do design thinking in our existing structures, and that will help us rewrite the ableist and racist structures of our world. And this is really something that I think I would love to hear more from. My main question, and I want to leave this back to the panelists, is I've been learning a lot about this, as I already said, in our labs, and also learning from all of you, but I would wonder if we could elaborate a little bit more, particularly for people that are less thinking about refusal, but particularly less thinking about refusal from the perspective of disability justice and the perspective of racial justice, is what is the intersection of these different refusal frameworks? How do we see these different frameworks as complementary? How do we see refusal from a racial justice perspective as complementary from refusal in disability rights? So at the beginning, Louise talked about like this notion of frictionless future and the idea we can write disability out in the future of design. Do some of these similar thinkings relate to race? Are there some existing types of thinking that suggest that we can write race out, but also people, queer people, trans people, racialized, disabled subjects? And how far does this, like, can this take us somewhere else as opposed to just framing us as problems to be solved? Particularly, and the reason I'm interested in this intersection is because I think we're going to have more and more practical policy sort of scenarios where refusal strategies of some groups are co-opted and undermined by like a corporate logic which divides and conquers different othered and oppressed communities. Like one particular example I'll give, and then I'll end, is that many of us working from a racial justice perspective on AI ethics and AI policy have really put forward the idea of that we need to dismantle the use of certain technologies and divest from certain technologies, particularly things like emotion recognition, particularly things like biometric categorization, because from our perspectives, they will continue the othering of us as subjects. What we've seen from a lot of the corporate AI ethics community and also corporate arguments is that many of these uses from a disability perspective should be useful, and therefore our strategies are exclusive from a disability perspective. And actually these corporate technologies can help various problems, as you've all outlined, from a disability perspective. Now, at least from my perspective, this is a really sort of attempt to co-opt and like use also many paternalistic discourses of disability. But then also then we have this question of how far do we undermine different practices of resistance if we're not taking into account this intersectional approach between how different forms of oppression combine. So I hope that example sort of like made practical why I'm interested in specifically understanding a little bit more how the panelists think that disability justice and racial justice approaches to refusal can complement each other, and the need to do that so that we can't essentially be exploited by not having a thought about these things together. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. This is already so rich. So I want to allow the panelists to respond to this really rich provocation that Sarah has just offered. Mara, I feel like I cut you off a bit. Do you want to have the first response?
Sure, I'll just say thank you so much, Sarah. That was really such a wonderful response. I'm excited to know more about your work. I'll just make one comment of in answer to your question about refusal and the tech industry, specifically thinking about corporations and not just about devices, and how refusal is racialized in different ways. One example that's just been present on my mind quite a lot lately has to do with NDAs and tech workers. I'm here in Texas doing work on the history of switchboard automation, and I've been thinking a lot about tech work, which is something we haven't really talked about yet on this panel. Tech work is also a form of use. Tech work is the kind of work that a lot of increasing numbers of people do. And in the US right now, there are a number of laws that are, including one in California called the Silenced No More Act, that are trying to prevent tech companies from forcing workers to sign NDAs, non-disclosure and non-disparagement agreements, as a condition of employment. And these are basically, it's similar to what Crystal was describing about not being able to opt out of knowing where one's data is being collected. These are all or nothing employment contracts that say if you don't sign them, you don't work, you don't have a job. And in signing these contracts, non-disparagement means saying anything negative about your employer at all, with Pinterest, Facebook, etc. And whether it's anything true, it's not slander, it's saying something truthful. And this means that people sign these just because you have to get a job. And later, if you're faced with sexual harassment or racism, and there've been a number of high profile cases around this lately in the tech industry, you're not allowed to talk about what happened to you. And this allows the continuation of transphobia, ableism, racism, sexism to be just built into those industries because the perpetrators are never named. And the person is just either quits or is paid off, and they've signed a gag order at the beginning of their employment. So people like Ifeoma Ozoma, who worked at Pinterest, recently broke her NDA, and to talk about racism at Pinterest. And you can be countersued if you break an NDA. It's very risky to do that. And so she's the lead figure putting the Silence to Know More Act forward. It's almost on the governor's desk, and it'll be really transformative in terms of US politics if that gets signed in, because California will then be the first state to have made it illegal to have these contracts as a condition of employment. So I just want to mention this as one example. There's also legislation promoted by tech corporations that utterly prevents people from refusing to sign certain things and from refusing to behave in a certain way in order to work at all, and basically to silence people from ever complaining and being able to make social change. And I had no idea this existed until a couple of years ago, because I'm in a different field, but it's quite terrifying to think that people's silence is being on such a huge sweeping scale in the tech industry is being purchased and compelled.
Thank you, Mara. Who would like to jump in?
Alexa, maybe I could possibly respond to Sarah, and possibly also to the Q&A question from Jenny. So I was thinking about how these frameworks come together, and I think that Sarah was inviting it towards the end of her response. And for me, they really are together. And I'm not going to, in this answer, at least talk about capitalism, but for me, that is a central theme, and hopefully we can come back to that. But there are two things that I think are important for me. So I really liked Crystal's phrase of the double bind. And I think, in a way, Mara's example, outstanding example of the archive for me is an illustration of the double bind, where the form of the archive, its material form, and its digital, and in some cases the digitized forms of archives, already determine the ways in which we can think. And I think people like Saidiya Hartman's work around archives is so important for me here, that the very organization and structure and language and what's made available through the archive dictate our ways, our modes of thinking. And I think that cuts through, whether we're talking about racial bodies or disabled bodies, etc., that cuts through all those. So I think that would be one way in which these things come together. And for those of us in science and technology studies and technoscience, feminist technoscience, that would be a familiar orientation to thinking about the materiality of technologies. I mean, and then the second thing that I think might enable this sort of combination or complementary set of frameworks is that the modes in which AI and machine learning are being largely used at the moment is this sort of monolithic or homogeneous treatment of the body. It's as though we can be reduced to a series of enumerations, and that if we are able to extract enough data from the body, we will create a generic model of everyone in their entirety. And I think that kind of deeply troubling view of what it is to be human is sort of being treated as this monolith, and that again is a thing that we could resist or refuse. And I think there are some nice examples in which AI isn't being used like that, but I suppose that's a conversation we can have that cuts across these frameworks of thinking about racial bodies and disabled bodies. I'll leave it there. I'm not sure I've actually responded to the question that was asked in the Q&A, but hopefully we can come back to that.
Yeah, thank you. I think this idea of the monolithic body is really important. Let me read this question because it is such a great question from Jenny. So thank you, Jenny. So Jenny says that feeling particularly grateful for the conversation about the archive and the significance of an archive of refusal, so that the refusals themselves are not obliterated or erased. Jenny's question is to the panel is, what an archive of refusal might look like in the overweening, over-promising orientations of AI technological development, with thanks there to Crystal for giving us this language to speak about this. Crystal, do you want to respond to this very interesting question?
Yes, I guess so. I wanted to like pick up first where Alex left off, and then I'll try to get there. We'll see what happens. So like, and then I'll also try to get to Sarah's point about like building solidarity. Anyways, I'm just gonna go. So I think in terms of like Alex's point about like AI thinking about monolithic ideas about what the body should look like, I mean, I think I can probably be a little bit more explicit about like the connection between disability and AI, in the sense that AI is essentially sexy stats. And what is stats but like thinking about the regression to the mean, which has a really, really large foundation in eugenic science, where like people were Francis Galton in particular was thinking about how to measure like moral and like physical deviance. And I think that's the kind of foundation of the system that we're talking about. So like eugenics is like quite literally the feature, not the bug. But so like zooming back out to the point that Mara was talking about in terms of tech work, and Sarah's point about building solidarity. I mean, I think all of these things are intertwined, and I would be very hesitant to like kind of disaggregate them in the way that you describe. So basically, I'm agreeing with you that like we can't really disaggregate all of these different social justice approaches, particularly when so much of the tech work, as Mara mentioned, is about breaking the solidarity, like, right? Like I think NDAs are like leveraged and weaponized as a way to like break worker power, in the same way that like a lot of the union busting across organizations like Google, et cetera, have been kind of working about, because I think like tech workers see themselves as somehow like not see themselves as not being part of the like a blue collar worker system that would benefit from protection. And so I think there are lots of different elements about like unionization, labor justice, racial justice, gender, and disability justice. I mean, I think all of these are intertwined, and like there's so many multiply marginalized people like throughout all of these systems that I do think they really like build on each other. And I think like to your examples, I think they're perfect ones, like the biometric identification and like emotional identification. I think those were the two examples that you used. I mean, I think like the fact that they excessively and punitively target folks of color is not an accident. And I think that that also holds true for, you know, folks who are neurodivergent, or thinking about different ways that bodies are identified in biometric systems, with like gait detection, for example, that like don't take into account like the possibility of wheelchair users. I mean, I guess all this to say, like, I think that building solidarity and like integrating all of these approaches to social justice are really important and like mutually reinforcing, and trying to think about how to do that more productively is something that I think the panel is really helping me think through.
Thank you, Crystal. I know we have so many fascinating threads already in play. Does anyone else want to pick up there? Mara,
I mean, just want to say I love the archive question, and I'm not sure I have an answer to it. And I you know, for this one collection, I completely trust the Lesbian Herstory Archives, who've been doing this sort of thing for a really long time, to think through what to do with these tapes and to preserve the actual physical tapes, even though they've now been digitized. I also just want to say, I see so many friends and colleagues in the participant list who know a lot and have thought a lot about archiving. Hi, Kevin. Gotkin, and Grayson Brillmeyer is here, and they're an amazing person who theorizes disability and queerness and transness in archives. And I have a feeling there's a lot of collective wisdom and people here who know more than I do. I presented as I would like to someday write about this collection, but I'm just sort of going back and forth with the archivist at the Lesbian History Archive and Marge Schneider, who founded the collection, and some of my blind friends and some of my blind lesbian friends trying to figure out how to do it, but I don't have an answer right now. I love the provocation about preserving refusal, and I think that's super important, and I've written it and taken a note about it, and thank you, Jenny, for mentioning that.
I just want to jump in here. Sorry, Alex, were you going to say something?
No, please, Louise, go ahead. Go ahead.
It's really interesting that you bring up Sylvia Hartman's work, Lose Your Mother, and I was really struck by that text in a way that as you go into the opening section of that book, it really is about the lives that Sylvia Hartman cannot document. She talks about the responsibility of having to do that work as a kind of historian, a kind of thinker. And I was thinking about how, Mara had talked about this in your archive, and now archives seem to be kind of a kind of thread that's really significant here. But, taking this back to kind of Sarah's work and proposition and our ongoing conversation, I'm really struck by where do we turn to as researchers, as like, what do we do with that refusal? Like, or how do we, in the case of Sylvia Hartman, where she talks about the responsibility of documenting lives that are not in the archive, right? So you have to, in some ways, you have to kind of imagine, or you have to kind of live them. And so I wonder, as researchers and people working in this area, like, there's a tendency to set responsibility as a kind of horizon, but I guess what is the other horizon is perhaps an anti-capitalist one. But I was just wondering if anybody like to build on that, or we can move on also.
Louise, can I connect that to a question that just came in? And there's great questions coming in. Thank you, everyone. We're going to try, I see them. We're going to try to weave them in. But there's a question here about how human rights-based approaches have been looked at as one possibility, but what may also be the limitations of those approaches. So just to sort of tag that on to the question that you've raised, Louise.
Can I follow up on, I think, Louise's point, and or maybe both Jenny and Raquel's points. What I really take from Sylvia Hartman's work is this sort of trying to imagine the impossible when it's been written out of the archive. And it as Louise has said, Lose Your Mother is such a powerful book that invites us to imagine the impossible. And so I think in terms of what an archive of refusal might be, it might be to leave those spaces open. And so rather than this kind of homogeneous, monolithic idea of completeness, that can we complete the idea of humanity or the idea of the human, it's an incompleteness and a heterogeneity of the human that becomes interesting. So, an archive of refusal might be many more modes of imagining what the human might be that are forever incomplete, if you will. And I think one of the questions I wanted to answer has disappeared. So that the question of infrastructures that's in the Q&A. So this is a question about whether we're able to think infrastructurally about these rather than specific cases. I think these are, in a way, these are exemplary cases of an infrastructural thinking. I mean, I did like Mara's point that as well as infrastructure, we're thinking about bottom-up, grassroots movements as well. Although I think those things are sort of, if you like, the same side of the same coin. But I think for me, this is an infrastructural mode of thinking. I'm always drawn to the phrase, Foucault's use of the conditions of possibility that have been taken up in feminist technoscience, that we're building conditions for thinking with, and that things like Mara's archival work are exemplary cases of how we begin to create new conditions for thinking in. And I see that as a kind of structural question. And I'm not sure if that answers Raquel's point specifically, but hopefully to some extent.
Thank you, and sorry about that. I dismissed the question. A little technical difficulty. So maybe I can introduce you a really interesting question about infrastructure. So this is Raquel writes about a curiosity about the interstices and borderlands and thinking with infrastructure studies. So much of the conversation about refusal seems to focus on specific artifacts and technologies. Infrastructures of various types, though, can feel a little more porous. How do we think about the spaces that are both working toward access and also still frictional? What does refusal look like in the context of infrastructures that become so foundational? Does anyone want to speak to that? I think, Sarah, did I see you nodding?
I can say something very briefly, but I think it really, I was nodding because it was also reminding me kind of a little bit about what Crystal was saying earlier about like the dominance of tech companies and particularly like what does it mean to actually refuse systems which have basically become in some ways very close to omnipotent, right? Like essentially I agree with the question. I think it's a really good question that a lot of conversation around refusal, at least as I see in the racial justice space, has looked at like different applications of technology, particularly because it's a very community-based practice that we're talking about, right? Which makes a lot of sense. We were going to exercise refusal in our community and in particular use cases where we see affect us. However, then thinking to the point of the relevance to the tech space, indeed not a lot of the conversation, and again, a lot of the focus of the AI ethics space has been about use cases, but not about infrastructures. Again, coming back to this question about capitalism, even the whole AI, you could say that even the whole AI debate is a red herring for what it should be a conversation about infrastructures. I've learned a lot from the work of Seda Gerses in this space, who has basically taught me that actually, yes, we can talk about bias, we can talk about discriminatory outcomes, we can talk about how certain technologies are not accurate or appropriate for differently constructed bodies, differently constructed identities. That's one thing. But if we don't deal with the fact that almost every AI system, every new technological development has to come through an infrastructural process, which is essentially governed by one of 8 companies, then we're talking about a very different question here, not just about access, not just about discrimination, but also centralization of power. And I have absolutely no answer to how we address that. But again, I think it comes back to this question about, we talk about intersectionality, intersectionality approach in very much a frame of identity, but that fundamentally has to address centralization and anti-capitalist approaches too.
I like this question on infrastructure because what I'm doing for 2 weeks right now in San Antonio is going through these papers in the AT&T archives here about switchboard automation, which has become this, it started in the 19-teens. It sounds really distant, but it's become present in a lot of AI researchers' minds because it's seen as one of the, probably the first full-scale automation of an electronics industry. And like the National Bureau of Economic Research in the United States I was surprised to see that those folks who I don't usually converse with have been looking back at telephone operators to see what happened to those people when the full infrastructure changed, what happened to those laborers, as a way to predict what might happen to laborers in other industries when an industry is automated. And their conclusion was basically that lots of people lost their jobs and they never recovered and weren't able to get back into another job market if they were of a certain age. So I decided to come here and see what was happening in the 19 teens. And the first thing I would say is automation takes a really long time. It took from the 19 teens to 1960 for telephone switchboards to be fully automated, meaning that you would use a dial or push button phone rather than talk to an operator. And so, you know, the myth of a revolution, an automation revolution, is not true. And there's a lot of time to make changes and to protest and to investigate and to watch and to interview people. It's a slow, I mean, it's probably a faster process now, but it's a slow process overall. But it is true that like infrastructural change is harder. It's harder to refuse because when one could refuse certain aspects device-wise, thinking about the question of like the telephone system. But when the whole infrastructure changes, if you don't get on board, you don't have a telephone. And there's lots of letters from disabled people who couldn't use the dial phone for different reasons, who missed being able to like just talk to an operator and have the operator place the call for them, but that was then gone. And of course, all the laborers who were fired didn't like the change either, but they had no choice. So infrastructural change can be sweeping. It can be almost impossible to refuse, but it's a slow process. And that means that if we're paying attention to it as it's happening, one interventions can be made along that path.
Thank you, Mara. Unbelievably, we're almost out of time. This has just been a fabulous conversation. So I'm going to pass to Louise to close, but I certainly hope we will find other ways to continue this conversation.
I want to thank all the panelists, but I also got a message from Hannah in the panel saying that whenever there's a panel on access, there's always so many links. And so I want to kind of thank everyone that's here today as a kind of collective practice of kind of just keeping an eye on the chat and adding links. And so that brings me a lot of joy that we do that for each other. I also want to thank the captioner today, Wendy, who was actually a recommendation from one of the Just AI fellows, Elma and Caroline, the Scorn Nation. So again, it's kind of paying tribute to kind of thinking about access and making the access infrastructure more visible. And of course, and we're in the middle of a panel on refusal, the kind of visualization of intimacy had its complexities and contradictions. But I want to thank everyone today, and I'm really excited to connect with everyone on the panel today and in the audience, and perhaps think of ways that we can continue this conversation as a working group. So thank you, everyone, and it was great to be here with you today. Thank you, Alexa, for moderating too, and Sarah responding. I'm just going to get gushy, so thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. What a joy to have this conversation.